Hello, I must admit this journey has been pretty exciting. So the idea is to use words or cultural derivatives from the Creole culture of St. Lucia, a tiny island in the Caribbean Sea near Barbados, St. Vincent and Martinique, and try and figure where did these things come about? How did these words or these cultural practices end up being part of the Creole culture of St. Lucia? So today we're going to be looking at something called Jere Largan. Now growing up, there were folktales of stories about finding a Jere Largan. Now finding a Jere Largan means that one would find and dig up buried treasure, which was in an olden clay jar, specific, a clay jar. Yes, an old clay jar was buried long time ago and somebody dug it up while either building a foundation or planting, and then they found this jar and it would be considered to be filled with treasures. That was specific. It was not a treasure chest like one would expect living in an island, a pirate island, with people like Jean de Bois, Francois Leclerc having had his base on Pigeon Point in St. Lucia. But yes, this was a Jere Largan in a jar. Yes, an old clay jar, right? Gold coins and rare trinkets and so forth were believed to have been buried and found in it. Now the older people used to say that was kind of a folk tale, right? This was not real and nobody actually found one of them, but that was part of the folklore, that you may find a Jere Largan and become rich. The story folklore goes that if one happened upon a Jere Largan, you should not speak, whether it is not to vocally exclaim that you found it or not to go out and tell anybody that you found it. It was never specific, but that was the story about finding a Jere Largan. Now, l'argent derived from the French language, l'argent, or D-A-R-G-E-N-T, d'argent, means money. So in French, l'argent, we can assume d'argent is the same, which means money. So a money jar, right? So I assume Jere was a jar. But Jere in French is not a jar or a vase. It's something different. So jeu, for example, J-E-U, which sounds like Jere, is game. So it would be a game of money. And then there are two Somali words in Jere, which means to see money, and J-E-R. So Nje d'argent would be see money, and J-E-E-R in Somali means times, so it would be times money. There's also an Igbo word, J-E-E-R-E, Jere, which means served. So it would be served money. But none of these seems to make much sense. But I looked into them because phonetically, these sounded like Jere d'argent, right? Either way, what we don't know is what the native word for jar was. But we can assume it might be something like Jere. But what we do know is that they were specific in the folklore that it was a clay jar that was buried in treasure. So let us dig into that. So did you know there was a Guarani people, an indigenous tribe, and they are recorded as burying their dead in large jars placed inverted in the ground? Isn't that interesting? Their funeral rituals involve burying the dead and some of their earthly valuables and possessions. Hence the idea of a jar in treasures. A jar containing treasures. But little did I expect it to be something like this, steeped in indigenous history and rituals. Even the idea of disturbing a sacred site. Maybe this is why the folklore explained to not talk while unearthing it, or rather, to not talk about it and go out and reveal the location of this jar, which is a sacred site and should not be disturbed. It is estimated that the Guarani numbered about 400,000 people when they were first encountered by Europeans. At that time, they were sedentary, agricultural, subsisting largely on manioc and maize, wild game and honey. Manioc is one key indicator that many indigenous tribes practiced similar cultures and had similar foods, instead of being isolated like what is originally believed, and being different groups like apart from each other, like the Taino and the Cardinalo. It appears that they had similar customs and foods and culture, if you look at Manioc, for example. Because it is said that the Taino word Kariba means the Manioc people, and possibly from the Florida Peninsula down to the Yucatan Peninsula, from Mexico, Panama, all the way down to Colombia, Venezuela, and the Guyanas. Note the similarity in the word Guyanas, G-U-I-A-N-A-S, and Guarani, G-U-A-R-A-N-I also. So the archipelago also as well, in the Caribbean Sea, from the bottom of the Florida Keys all the way down to Trinidad and Tobago, there were natives as well, and people on both sides used Mayoc. So we need to consider the idea that the indigenous were not a sedentary people and were very mobile people using their seafaring technologies and knowledge of the currents and winds to navigate the circumference of the Caribbean Sea and all that encompasses it. Think of the canoes that Columbus and other conquistadors said that they noticed when they got into the Caribbean, noting that some of the children were also body surfing at the time. So here we have it. We can start thinking that the conquistadors were quite aware that the Guarani and the indigenous people may have been not just isolated tribes, but moving around the whole of the Caribbean, all the way down to Trinidad and Tobago. Now, little is known about the Guarani society and beliefs, but it is known that they practice a form of mystic rituals, right? And some of it is surviving folklores in numerous myths. Many of the Caribbean islands are named after animals, like St. Lucia, Ayanola, which means iguanas above. Now, the Guarani people are recognized as a group of culturally related indigenous tribes, and they live in South America. They are distinguished from the related Tupi by the use of the Guarani language. The traditional range of the Guarani people is in what is now Paraguay, between the Parana River, Lower Paraguay River, the Misiones province of Argentina, southern Brazil, and once as far east as Rio de Janeiro and parts of Uruguay and Bolivia. There are Guarani populations in Paraguay, parts of Argentina and Bolivia. The Guarani language is still widely spoken across traditional Guarani homelands and is one of the two official languages in Paraguay. Imagine that before 1492 and the arrivals of the Portuguese, the size of the population that the indigenous had in the Caribbean, Latin, and South America. So imagine an advanced society watching a man plant a flag and stating he is claiming the land and their peoples in the name of the king, a king they know nothing of. The idea and the concept may have been bewildering and absurd to them, but the foreign-looking people were willing to use force and violence to enforce their precepts on the people and to take their land. This must have been difficult to understand for people more in touch with nature, for people that revered nature, to see men fight over material things and land that will be left when one dies. Must have been hard to understand. Essentially, valuing material things more than life itself. The history and meaning of the name Guarani are subject to dispute. Before they encountered Europeans, the Guarani referred to themselves simply as Aba, A-B-A, meaning men or people. Reminds me of the ancient language, like Semitic languages, with Abba, Father in them, the Lord's Prayer. The term Guarani was originally applied by early Jesuit missionaries to refer to natives who had accepted conversion to the Christian religion. Kaya or Kainga was used to refer to those who had refused Christianization. Kaya is roughly translated as one from the jungle, while the term Cayua, Kayua, is sometimes still used to refer to settlements of indigenous people who have not well integrated into the dominant society. So Kayua is still used. Now, we already did a video on the Florida Keys, or K-A-Y-E, or Cayo, like Cayo Agua, or Cayo in Spanish, right? Which is summarized may mean people or residents of a place. So imagine Kai is consistent, right? So Mamaila Kai is used in St. Lucia, Cayo is used in Spanish. So other possible derivatives is from the Creole language Beke or Beche or Bekai, right? So Beke, which it means a European or a white man. But when you break it down, it can mean a foreigner. K means not of, right? So Kaye might mean the people, but Beke might mean not of, Beke, right? So just an idea to think of, right? Barbara Gerson writes that the name Guarani was given by the Spanish as it means warrior in the Tupi-Guarani dialect spoken there. Guarani is attested in the 12th century Old Tupi by Jesuit sources as war, warriors, to wage war, warlord. We must remember the same labeling of aggressive, uncivilized, warlike cannibals were given to the Kalinagu as well, right? So warlike warriors. It almost like was a trope to say that we need to civilize those people and Christianize them. Now, the Guarani demographic dominance of the region was subsequently reduced by European colonization and the commensurate rise of mestizos. The first governor of the Spanish territory of Guyara initiated a policy of intermarriage between European men and indigenous women. The descendants of these matches characterize the Paraguayan nation today. The laws of the Indies forbade slavery in some of the Hispanic areas, but that did not prevent people from trying to enslave the indigenous people, and a lot of them got enslaved. The center depot of the slave trade was the town of Sao Paulo, present-day Brazil. Originally a rendezvous place for Portuguese and Dutch pirates, it later became a refuge for criminals who mixed with Native Americans and African women and actively participated in the capturing and selling of Guaranis as slaves. To oppose these armed and organized robbers, the tribes had only their bows and arrows. Many Guaranis were slain or enslaved by the slave hunters active in Brazil during those years.